Excellent. Hello, all. Thank you so much for coming today, and welcome to the Cambridge Disaster Research Network seminar on Hurricane Katrina and its long-term effects on New Orleans and the US Gulf Coast. I'm Ellen Kuyava. I'm a PhD student in the Department of Geography at the University of Cambridge, studying hurricanes in the Caribbean. So this topic is quite relevant to my own interests. I'm joined by co-conveners, and since this is our first session of Lent term, we'll do a quick round of introductions. Ainsley, would you like to start?
Would love to. Thanks, Ellen. I'm Ainsley. I'm a first-year PhD here in the Department of Geography at Cambridge, and I'm looking at earthquake risk management in the post-Soviet space.
Roy, would you like to go next?
Sure thing. Happy New Year, everyone. I guess I can still get away with saying that. I'm Roy Walsh. I'm a postdoc in the Geography Department working on imaginaries and different knowledge types of disaster risk in South America, particularly for volcanoes.
Thank you. Tilly, you want to say hello?
Yeah, hello everyone. I'm Tilly. I'm from Durham University, actually, in the Department of Geography, and I look at care in wildfire risk management. But yeah, thank you.
And finally, Maria.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Maria, and I'm a second-year PhD student in the engineering department, and my research works at climate change, physical infrastructure systems, and public health.
Fantastic.
Emma might be on the call as well.
Yes, I'm on the call.
You just say hello. Sorry, Emma, I didn't see you.
No, that's all good. Hi everyone, I'm Emma. I'm a new convener this year. I'm a second year PhD student in the history department at the University of Cambridge, and I look at famine relief in comparative perspective in the 19th century. So nice to meet you all.
Thank you so much. Okay, great. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. The Cambridge Disaster Research Network's mission is to connect disaster researchers and practitioners at Cambridge and beyond. And today we're doing a pretty good job of the beyond part, since we have 3 panelists from outside of Cambridge. Typically, our seminars focus on a research theme in disaster risk reduction, and then speakers highlight that research theme through case studies. This term, we're doing that a little bit differently, and we're structuring seminars around individual case studies and then asking speakers to discuss different research focuses. Today's seminar focuses on Hurricane Katrina. 2005's Hurricane Katrina is often referred to as one of the greatest disasters of the 21st century. Recent estimates put the death toll at 1,392 people and the total cost of damage between $97 and $145 billion, though other estimates are much higher. At the time, it was the most costly hurricane on record. It is now tied with 2017's Hurricane Harvey. It was particularly devastating for the city of New Orleans, where approximately 80% of the city was underwater, and it displaced more than 1 million people in the Gulf Coast region. It spurred national and global discussions of flood protection, equity and justice, and how the media covers hazards and disasters, and it's left a complex political and social legacy in the United States and beyond. Today, we invite 3 speakers to discuss aspects of this legacy. First, Professor Elizabeth Fussell, Professor of Population Studies and Environment and Society at Brown University, who will be talking to us about race and housing turnover and loss in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. Second, Lamar Gardere, Executive Director and my old boss at the Data Center in New Orleans, who will be discussing his 2020 paper on how data became part of New Orleans' DNA during the Katrina recovery. And finally, Professor Patrick Roberts from the Center for Public Administration and Policy at Virginia Tech, who will talk about the complex legacy of Katrina, how it's changed thinking on risk, resilience, and sustainability. We're so excited to have them all here. Welcome to all 3 of you, and thank you so much for joining us. A note on how things will work today. Each presenter will speak for about 10 to 15 minutes, and audience, please hold your questions until the full Q&A at the end. Professor Roberts will need to leave us at 4 p.m., so please do get your questions to him early. Our other 2 speakers can stay a few extra minutes if necessary, but we'll wrap up probably just a few minutes past the hour. I'll moderate that discussion, and I'll say this again at the end, but you can raise your hand via the Zoom raise hand function or put your questions in the chat. And with that, Dr. Fussell, would you like to begin?
Sure, thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here and speaking with all of you. So let me get my slides going. Sorry, do you can you see the screen? Doesn't
appear to be sharing yet.
Okay. Let me just get back here. How's now? Not yet?
Nope, sorry.
Okay. Sorry about that.
It's okay. It wouldn't be a Zoom meeting without something like this.
Okay. Sorry, let me just start over again. Or if you would like to share my slides, that might be an easier way to go.
Let me see if I can do that. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Can you
All right.
Yeah, there we go.
Okay, just let me know when to advance.
All right, thank you. So my talk today focuses on Hurricane Katrina's impact on New Orleans, in which I'm investigating housing as a mechanism connected to disasters, racial inequality, housing turnover, and loss. I think this is a better way to understand the unequal population recovery of New Orleans because it really demonstrates the mechanism by which the return of population was so unequal by race. Okay, next slide. So this is a slide showing the population composition of the city of New Orleans, Orleans Parish, in every year from 2000 through 2019. And we can see that after Hurricane Katrina, there was a loss of 50% of the population, but this disproportionately affected the non-Hispanic Black population. We know that floodwater and damage to the built environment was the cause of displacement of the entire Orleans Parish population for at least 6 weeks. But for many, this displacement lasted much longer. On average, Black residents returned later and in lower proportions than other residents. And this meant that there was the relative proportion of Black residents that decreased relative to other groups in the post-disaster years. So next slide. Researchers and the public have asked why population recovery was so unequal. After all, the 1977 Stafford Act, which provides the basis for allocating post-disaster recovery assistance, promises to restore disaster-affected residents to their pre-disaster condition. And so in theory, this should mean that race shouldn't make a difference in post-disaster outcomes. But clearly it did. Michael Dyson wrote a book, Come Hell or High Water, Hurricane Katrina and the Color of Disaster. And I think this is a very apt phrase for for framing the puzzle that my talk seeks to address. Why should disasters have a color or be race selective? His thesis was that disaster exposed structural racism, although his argument focused mainly on the emergency period. And since then, research has shown that the cumulative effect of racial residential segregation placed more Black residents in harm's way, and labor market and economic inequality meant that Black residents had fewer resources to prepare for and recover from the disaster. So these pre-disaster risk factors are evident from the spatial statistics that show neighborhoods with higher proportions of African-American residents and fewer socioeconomic resources tended to have higher flood depths. My colleague Narayan Sastry and I analyzed data that was collected 18 months after Hurricane Katrina called the Displaced New Orleans Residents Survey, where we were able to show that Black residents returned to New Orleans later and in lower proportions than non-Black residents. But this statistically significant difference became insignificant when housing damage was included in the model. So it was a strong indicator that race and housing had an important role to play in explaining the unequal population recovery. In addition, this GAO report, which is, for those of you who aren't from the States, this is a report from the Government Accountability Office that is an independent research unit that investigates federal spending. And they concluded that federal assistance for permanent housing primarily benefited homeowners, and opportunities exist to better target rental housing needs. So this is part of the explanation for this unequal recovery is the homeowner bias. But another part of the unequal recovery explanation is the fact that Black homeowners had lower pre-disaster home values. And because the Louisiana Road Home Program keyed recovery assistance to the value of your pre-disaster home, this meant that people living in neighborhoods with lower home values received smaller grants, even though the cost of rebuilding your home would be effectively the same at current market prices. Okay, next slide. So the US Department of Housing and Urban Development collects a survey called the American Housing Survey, and New Orleans happened to be one of the sampled cities in 2004, which means that this data has pre- and post-disaster housing information, housing and population information. And I took advantage of this data set to look at the role of housing in post-disaster recovery. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide. It's kind of technical, so let's move to the next slide. So the data show here, what in 2009, what was the change between 2004 and 2009 in the status of the housing unit? And so the blue bar shows that by race or overall, the leftmost column shows overall, 49% of housing units had the same resident in 2009 as that lived in the housing unit in 2004. 29% had a new resident in 2009, meaning that there was turnover in the housing. And then 22% overall of housing units were vacant or demolished in 2009. I then break this down by race, with non-Hispanic whites being the next set of columns, non-Hispanic Blacks, then non-Hispanic other or mixed race, which is a weird category that you have to use with Census Bureau data, and then Hispanics finally on the rightmost side. And so what we can see by looking at this, this set of bars is that non-Hispanic Black residents, compared to all other racial groups, had much lower proportions of residents living in the same housing unit in 2009 as lived in the housing unit in 2004. And furthermore, what I find really interesting is that the proportion of housing units that were occupied by Black residents in 2004 were far more likely, over twice as likely as all the other groups, to be vacant or demolished. So this is the dependent variable in my multi-level, multinomial logistic regression analysis. So let's go to the next slide. Then my explanatory variables, I have a lot of control variables, but I looked at the housing unit and neighborhood characteristics to see how each of these racial groups differed in terms of their housing tenure, the type of housing unit that they occupied, the housing quality and the neighborhood quality. The main thing I want you to see is that all of these distributions are statistically significantly different from one another, and that it is non-Hispanic Blacks who tend to be most different from the other groups in terms of their housing and neighborhood characteristics in 2004. I'm going to go through this quickly again in the interest of time. So let's go to the next slide. So this is my model setup, multinomial logistic regression with two dependent variables. So I'm comparing the housing turnover and housing loss to having the same resident in the housing unit in both years. Okay, next slide. So these are the results for the explanatory variables that I showed you, as well as race. And so what we can see is that housing unit characteristics were statistically significant in explaining the differences in the likelihood of there being a new resident or the housing unit being vacant or demolished. What's interesting here is that for the new resident column, non-Hispanic Blacks were no different in the housing units occupied by non-Hispanic Blacks were no more likely than other housing units occupied by other groups to have a new resident after you take into account all of the housing unit characteristics. However, there is a racial difference in the likelihood of a housing unit being vacant or demolished, even after you have these other controls. And Black residents, housing units occupied by Black residents were 75% more likely to be vacant or demolished. Okay, next slide. So the way I interpret these results is that there's, after years and years and decades of racial residential segregation and disinvestment in the neighborhoods that were racially segregated where non-Hispanic Blacks lived, that disinvestment meant that lower home values led to lower quality housing, lower property values on those housing units, lower likelihood of home ownership, and many other of the kind of what basically race became embedded in the built environment in a way that made Black residents and residents of Black neighborhoods more likely to be exposed to the deeper floodwaters and the more destructive forces of Hurricane Katrina, which were really mainly it was really the depth of the floodwater, because of the way that New Orleans is a bowl-shaped below sea level city. The way that the Black residents had been segregated into areas that were lower lying, more flood prone, and this meant that when the levees broke, those neighborhoods became significantly more likely to be inundated and with deeper flood depths. So I want to just, pulling back from the specific case of Hurricane Katrina, I want to just say that this housing segregation, racially based housing segregation, is not unique to New Orleans. It's a nationwide process that builds risk into racially segregated Black neighborhoods and increases vulnerability to disaster-related displacement and housing loss. Next slide. So I, basically I just gave away the punchline. Race is built into housing and neighborhoods. This is really well established in the literature on housing. So I have two really excellent books, The Color of Law and Race for Profit. These are books that are relatively recently published that in the US that would substantiate this argument that the residential racial segregation, the nationwide history of it, the way that it has continued even after the 1968 fair housing laws made racial segregation illegal, will continue to have this kind of impact for disaster when disasters occur. That the quality of housing and racial segregation into more vulnerable neighborhoods disproportionately exposes Black residents to the effects of disasters. Okay, I'll wrap it up there, but thank you. I look forward to your questions and to this conversation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fussell. Lamar, would you like to start?
Sure, I will try to get my screen shared here. I think that should be it.
Looks great.
Great, good. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody, depending on where you are. I am Lamar Gardere, Executive Director of the Data Center. And most of the stories that you hear about Katrina and New Orleans will highlight ultimately a negative outcome. This is a positive story of something gained, something that New Orleans has gained and strengthened since New Orleans. Since Katrina. So we're going to look at how Katrina impacted the DNA of the city as it relates to data. The data center is a data intermediary. I'm going to skip the about us because we didn't talk about us quite a bit during the presentation and jump right in. So, as you know, Hurricane Katrina happened August 29, 2005, and changed life as we knew it. But before there was Hurricane Katrina, the data center was already here and doing work. The reason that that's important is because in order to be effective during a disaster, you must be present before that disaster, right? And not just existing. It means you have to be functioning well. You have to be in place, widely respected. You have to be able to respond immediately after the event and for the long term, which means you have to have enough capacity to do so. And then you need to continually be able to scan the horizon for changes in data and technology and react and respond so that you're able to continue to meet needs. To do that, let's just talk a little bit about the data center's history and how we got here and helped contribute to this emerging DNA in our city. We were established with the dual goal of making statistics more relevant and accessible while building community capacity and willingness to use these numbers and to think in terms of data. And as it turned out, people loved it. I mean, who knew that people would be this excited about data, right? Every time we went somewhere, whether it be a meeting or show up in a phone call, whatever it might be, you would see people at the store or at some sort of event, the movies or whatever it might be, and people would ask you about data. Do you have data? Where can I get this data? I'm working on this thing and I need this data. You know, it turns out that folks were really, really interested in data, and we focused originally in the nonprofit community, helping to provide data for their programming and to support their grant-making needs and things like that. So from about 1997 to about 2001, this is kind of how we worked, working directly with folks trying to raise their capacity and things like that. At some point, we realized that's just not going to do. That's not good enough. We can't reach enough people fast enough. So in 2002, remember, this is still kind of early on in the internet's days, right? So 2002 is when we first developed our website. And we took all of that information that we had been collecting in those requests that we were getting from people. We collected all of that and put our effort into developing a website that could answer 80% of the questions that we were receiving out there. And we did that largely through dividing New Orleans into, well, New Orleans was already divided into 73 neighborhoods. Fortunately, we were able to provide data on each of those 73 neighborhoods, which was a great way to engage folks, right? If you're in the US and you're familiar with the way the Census Department provides data, they provide at the census tract level, but nobody knows like what census tract 1703 is, right? That's not relatable. You can't do anything with that. But if I tell you that I have data on Mid-City, or the central business district, then you immediately identify with that. You know what that is. You know what your perspective is relative to that particular area in the city. And so providing it along the lines of the 73 neighborhoods works to really get people's attention. The other 20% of questions that were out there, we filled with a feature called Ask Allison. Allison Plyer was and still is a trusted staffer at the data center. She's our chief demographer now, and she was very well known in the community for providing data. And so putting Asking Allison on the website provided a human face for this technology and data need that people would have. And folks really, really gravitated to it. Before long, we were just democratizing data all over the place, right? We were publishing these articles on how to use data, how to think about data, how to write about data, how to use it for impact, how to talk about it in a way that would move your particular issue forward. And the data capacity around the city was really starting to increase as a result. And then Hurricane Katrina hit. And federal statistics about New Orleans, including the 2020 census, which is, if you know data in the US, that's where a huge amount of our data comes from, these census surveys. It all became instantly obsolete, right? None of the existing federal data, almost none of the existing federal data in New Orleans was relevant anymore because the population had completely emptied out, scrambled about, and changed. Almost overnight, our website went from about 5,000 visits per month to 120,000 visits in the 2 months after Katrina. So there was simultaneously a hunger for data and a lack of it. Well, if you are studying disasters, you know, and we will say that one of the core things to understand and to know is that disasters exacerbate existing trends. While the trends that were in play at the time was improved data capacity at the data center, and unfortunately, weakness within city government as it relates to technology infrastructure, including the personnel that were there. So the disaster exacerbated that, pushing tons and tons and tons of national, local, all types of media attention to the data center, looking for data. We had to innovate new ways to provide that data and to provide insight into what was happening in New Orleans because there was such a rush for that data. At the same time, it very much exposed the weaknesses in city governments. A researcher from Brookings was quoted in the New York Times saying it was easier to gather data from Iraq than from New Orleans at the time. When local government loses legitimacy, trusted local data intermediaries can help fill key gaps until local government can get back on its feet. And that's exactly what we did. So from here, the data center realized we have to transform. We are not going to just be able to publish data about neighborhoods anymore. We can't use our same, publicly available data sets. We're going to have to innovate on new private sector data sets. And we're going to have to shift from just publishing numbers to doing analysis, right? That's a whole different thing, being able to write a narrative analysis to bring understanding to the data for folks, and to write in a way that is plain language, right? Where regular people can understand it, where community folks can understand it. Turns out even academics appreciated the plain language way that we were communicating data. And we made that shift in partnership with the Brookings Institute, who really helped to teach us how to do this analysis and write about it in a neutral way. And in 2006, we began to publish the New Orleans Index. First, we published it on a monthly basis, and then eventually an annual, and then tailing off towards the 10-year anniversary of Katrina. But we greatly expanded the things that we did, from Asking Allison in a website to all of these publications looking at key things in the city of New Orleans. That was a really important thing because the index built on the data center's reputation and Brookings' reputation for credibility, trust, and neutrality. And it absolutely pushed progress and recovery forward in New Orleans. It built a shared understanding and common operating picture among diverse stakeholders, right, across the political spectrum, across the racial and gender spectrum. People, through the work that we were publishing, could begin to agree on the facts and just have conversations around solutions, whereas the facts were in question before. These outcomes spurred innovation, focused on solutions instead of facts. Having an increased ability to communicate to officials and investors who are outside of New Orleans to reduce uncertainty. All of these things were independently evaluated by folks and determined that the Data Center and the New Orleans Index helped to create this ecosystem that could be relied on for recovery. But a single nonprofit actor or even a collection of nonprofit actors cannot recover a city on its own. So at some point, city government had to step up. Right. So in 2010, a new administration began, and this administration was focused, absolutely laser focused on taking a whatever it takes attitude to recovering New Orleans, returning it to a place of respectability, accountability, transparency, things like that. Actually bringing accountability and transparency that we really hadn't seen before in New Orleans. In between national interest in helping New Orleans recover and this new leadership that was emerging at the municipal level, there was a tremendous amount of civic energy that was created within the city of New Orleans. The city stabilized its IT systems and began the process of restoring its credibility, which created a renewed focus on citizen engagement. The data center also served as a partner to the city around data-driven decision-making. This little picture at the bottom right here, this tie-dye parcel layer picture, what we're showing there, what I'm suggesting there is that the city and various community organizations developed a bootleg parcel layer, right? The parcel layer is the record of all the land in the city and various data tied to each parcel of land. Very, very important if you're trying to recover and think about zoning and code enforcement and various restrictions that have to happen for recovering and rebuilding to actually happen. The city was not publishing this data in any publicly available way at the time. And so some concerned city employees leaked the parcel layer data to community organizations who then distributed it in an underground network of data actors around the city, just demonstrating that there was a real hunger for data at the time and a growing community level sophistication to analyze that data, right? What use is there to putting out parcel level data if the community doesn't have the ability to analyze it? So this is sort of the beginning of this real civic energy around data. Fortunately, the city and the data center were really able to work together to harness that energy. And that included the data center stepping up in important ways by exchanging talent with the city. Denise Ross, who was co-director at the city, at the data center, moved on over to city government. Melissa Shagoda, Ben Horowitz, a number of folks moved from the data center into city government, improving and increasing capacity within city government to produce data, to organize it, to visualize it, to communicate about it, and use it for data-driven decision-making. I worked for the city government at the time and eventually moved over to the data center, taking my knowledge of municipal information, municipal processes and things into the data center to help provide another a level of engagement between municipal data and city government. Denise Ross actually eventually went on to be and she still is, she is right now, the United States chief data scientist. So data center alum have gone all over to do significant things, but most importantly, lended its own capacity to city government for the improvement of the city. And with that, we were able to tackle the first big problem together, blight eradication in New Orleans. As you can imagine, when 80% of your city is underwater, there are tons of houses that need to be torn down and rebuilt, and many of them end up in a blighted state, just like the one you see on the left side of the screen here. The goal was to reduce blight by 10,000 units in 4 years. That goal was set by city government based on advice that the data center put forward, and we worked together on how to do that. The great thing about these stat meetings is that it was a forum for the data to be put forth and for government leader to engage directly with citizens on that data and how it improves their own lives. From there, New Orleans just continued to blossom as an open data a mecca of sorts. These are all quotes from various media organizations locally and nationally praising the new transparency and accountability within city government, its ability to put out good and timely data. That ability to improve its data led to better websites that better informed businesses, that better informed residents, that better informed outside actors who, looking into New Orleans, now felt an increased sense of confidence in our city's recovery and therefore interest in investment. Those efforts continue today with data-driven New Orleans, an effort out of city government, where they continue to make data open and freely available. There are now about 221 data sets open and freely available. There's a data center, an open data policy now within city government that data must be open first, and you have to have a reason to not make it public, as opposed to it being shrouded behind city systems and you have to request it. So a huge change in terms of the city's willingness to put forth data. To close out, there are a number of lessons learned here, right, from what happens in terms of data capacity when disasters happen. One, always lead with the people and information and the information that the people need, not the technology. Build systems along with stakeholders. The value of the data intermediary lies not just in the data work that it does, but also in the talent that it develops within your locality. Don't go it alone. Partner with folks locally and nationally to have the bigger, better, lasting impact that you need. And then use data intermediaries to build up that crucial civic data infrastructure that helps you to navigate shocks and stressors more effectively. I'm happy to say that this continues to be one of the bright spots in New Orleans post-Katrina that is only continue to improve. Thank you, Ellen, so much, and everyone else for inviting us to this conversation and allowing us to present this to you today. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Lamar. That was a great presentation, and it's so cool to hear such an interesting success story in the wake of Katrina. Professor Roberts, would you like to share your slides?
Yes, great. Thank you. They should be sharing now. I'm Patrick Roberts, a professor at Virginia Tech University in Arlington, Virginia, and I'll talk about the legacy of Hurricane Katrina for disaster recovery research and practice, and what research and new practices were spawned by the Hurricane Katrina event. Recovery takes decades from major events, and funds from Hurricane Katrina, that is federal government funds to support recovery, are still being spent in 2023. So the recovery, at least as defined by spending, can take decades, and this is true of other likely true of other major disasters as well. So from one definition, we're still in the recovery phase, even though major lifelines and community functions have long been restored. I looked at the response to Hurricane Katrina and the recovery as part of a longer story of the increasing role of the federal or national government of the United States in managing preparedness, response, and recovery to disasters. Something that was once local responsibility became more and more a national government. There's a greater national government role in the United States, although at the same time, many of the decisions that lead to risk and vulnerability to disasters were not always made at the national or federal government level, but were made by a constellation of actors, private individuals, neighborhoods, businesses, local state governments. So often, in this case, the national government gets blamed for major disaster events and losses, but they often don't control the underlying factors that lead to risk and vulnerability. What have we learned about disaster recovery following Hurricane Katrina? Hurricane Katrina brought to light the surprising and important destruction. Wow, this can happen here in the United States. That this brought to light the complexities of disaster risk and recovery, and it brought to light a few issues in recovery. One, social capital, the ties among people and community groups and their skills can be very important in bouncing back quickly from disasters, and different groups have more or less access to social capital, and there's a flowering of social capital research after Katrina. Two, the role of local government capacity is very important, as Lamar and others talked about, and a major disaster like Hurricane Katrina can provide a shock to local government capacity, where the tax base and so on. And then an equitable distribution of political power is important for recovery planning and the actual recovery, as Dr. Fussell talked about in the housing debate at the neighborhood level. And these three areas have received a lot of attention after Hurricane Katrina in the research literature. At a high level, we know that some communities will bounce back quickly after disasters, and some never come back. We talked about the neighborhood level in the two prior presentations, but two other historical examples along the Gulf Coast of the United States. One, there's a town called Indianola, which was a significant port city in Texas in the 19th century, but it suffered a major hurricane and never recovered. Meanwhile, a neighboring city of Galveston, near present-day Houston, suffered a major hurricane in 1900, but it did recover because of its wealth and its importance as a port city. So some communities have access to funds, to political power, to social capital, all of these things, and they'll bounce back. But some communities won't, and so a lot of recovery planning and research has gone into what are the factors that will help communities, whether neighborhoods, cities, regions bounce back. And as we know, after Hurricane Katrina, New Orleans population changed at the neighborhood level, and we saw this in both the prior presentations, but Lamar's really showed us that the character of neighborhoods is different, and there were differential recoveries in different neighborhoods, and some parts of New Orleans are richer today, and in some the racial and ethnic character is different, and in some neighborhoods the people living there are different. And the data center has done amazing work. If we didn't have that prior presentation, I would talk about how amazing the data center's work has been, and what a great data source it is, and what a relatively easily interpretable data source it is if you're interested in learning more about Hurricane Katrina. But there are great data showing the differential recovery at the neighborhood level. So I think that's one way to think about communities in New Orleans. They're different neighborhoods. And so what have we learned from the literature? Well, I think we've learned improving disaster recovery requires more than better technology or money alone. So there's some statements of optimism in disaster recovery strategy, that things are going to get better, or if only we had more money spent, or technology is improving all the time. We have new alert systems, et cetera, new and better seawalls. But I think the complex reality that was shown by Hurricane Katrina and other major events is that it's more complex. Why do some areas recover more slowly or not at all? The reasons are more complex. We saw in New Orleans, in some cases where recovery spending was higher, some of these areas were simply the most damaged, and they were slower to recover because they had the most severe problems to begin with. So I think this gets at Dr. Fussell's comments on the unequal distribution of risk and vulnerability. It's a nationwide problem, perhaps it's a worldwide problem, but it manifests itself at the local community, neighborhood, civic level. And so the storm Hurricane Katrina made some of the problems of decaying infrastructure, crime, blight, more visible in the immediate months after the storm. A lot of conversation was around that. But hurricane recovery spending alone couldn't cure these long chronic problems that were problems in New Orleans. There are problems in many cities, nationwide and worldwide. So what do we learn? If greater spending is too simple, how can we make recovery more effective? What can be done? One idea is social capital. Improve social capital. A lot of great research has been conducted after Hurricane Katrina on social capital, supplementing it by government capacity, particularly local government capacity. It was local government knows the neighborhoods, it knows the community, it's connected to the community. And two, political power. How can we more equitably distribute political power across neighborhoods, across communities, the communities that Dr. Fussell talked about, or simply at the neighborhood level? Those are two ideas that I think have come out of the literature since Hurricane Katrina. And social capital really is an important property of community resilience. That is, how do communities, neighborhoods, regions bounce back? And this is one thing that has really come out of not Hurricane Katrina alone. I cite Russell Dine's article from before Katrina, but a real greater depth of understanding of what social capital means has come out of the post-Katrina research. There are more social ties, community members can rely on one another, the communities can bounce back. But I think Hurricane Katrina also shows the situation is more complicated. There are these unequal distributions of risk, as Dr. Fussell talked about. And so we want to know, as researchers and practitioners, what really slowed recovery at the community level, and what could hasten or speed up recovery, because we want to do that in the future in other cases. In some research I've conducted with colleagues on recovery from Hurricane Marina in Puerto Rico, we found that I know Ellen is doing research on Puerto Rico. They're now the capacity for public engagement by municipal governments in Puerto Rico was associated with faster recovery. We found, and maybe this is true in other cases as well, as a supplement to social capital, which we know from literature is really important. Puerto Rico has 78 municipalities, and when we looked at and compared those, we developed a capacity index, different elements of local government capacity. One of those is capacity for public engagement. It's sort of money, programs, and people doing that. Not every municipality had that. We controlled for damage levels because there are different damage levels, storm exposure levels across Puerto Rico, although Hurricane Maria really impacted the entire island. We developed an index of recovery along social dimensions and economic dimensions, and we looked at what was associated with faster recovery. And really, one of the things we found that was robustly associated, and really the only thing, was this capacity for public engagement by municipal governments when we controlled for differential damage. And so maybe this is an important ingredient in other events as well. So what are the high-level takeaways from Katrina and other disasters for how do we do recovery better? I think one is social capital, that is the civic skills and ties within communities, maybe within a neighborhood, within groups, within blocks, and also between those neighborhoods, groups, blocks, and external groups, that whether it's churches or governments or national associations. Social capital that's politically engaged should include measures of civic skills, such as speaking, writing, organizing ability, basic civic skills, as well as measures of representation on things like planning commissions and access to politicians. This is social capital that seems to be important in recovery, and we got at that through some really qualitative measures. Two, high-level takeaway, government capacity for community engagement is associated with faster recoveries, and that is local government capacity. Puerto Rico's case, these municipalities, but really the local government level is so important, as Lamar and others have talked about and found. The federal government can provide expertise and resources and frameworks, but local government capacity for engaging the community is very, very important. Data center, certainly part of that. Three, political power and representation are important for social capital and recovery. I was trained as a political scientist, although I do public administration and public policy now, and that political power and representation becomes important. Again, we identified that through some qualitative measures. I think that's where some of the research and some of the practice has gone after Katrina, in part spawned by the attention given to Hurricane Katrina, and hopefully over time we can do and practice recovery better and have faster recoveries, and hopefully localities, nations can realize that recovery from major events is something we're going to have to deal with. It's often politically unpalatable for politicians to admit, but let's think about doing it better and faster in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Roberts. And thank you all again so much for being here with such interesting presentations. At this point, I will stop our recording and we will move to a discussion.